The woman who raised me was sitting beside the caterer's water glasses, beside the service door, at my wedding. Her place card used her full name, like she was hired help who had wandered too close to the family. I thought it was a mistake. Then Lady Armitage leaned toward me and said, "From today on, there is only one mother this family recognizes in public." It was not a seating mistake. It was a message. She wanted to erase 21 years of my life and replace them with a story that looked better in photographs. I looked around the chapel courtyard. Ushers avoided my eyes. Cousins suddenly became fascinated by flower arrangements. Rosa stood still with the quiet dignity only truly good women have. 5 minutes before I walked down the aisle, my future family decided she was too ordinary to be seen near me. Then I looked at Julian. He already knew. What none of them knew was that I had saved every draft guest list, every sponsor note, and every voice message. 3 hours later, I would put that proof in front of 200 guests. They could admit what they did to Rosa, or they could let the room hear the truth they had prepared to bury. I looked for Julian because I needed one honest face. Instead, I found calculation dressed up as distress. He said his mother was under pressure from sponsors. He said older patrons would not understand complicated family optics. He told me to get through the ceremony, and he would make it right in private. Private! That word told me everything. He knew his family was wrong. He chose reputation anyway. He was wearing the signet cufflinks I had given him after he promised I would never stand alone in his world. The silver initials flashed at his wrists while he defended that seating chart. It felt worse than a slap. There is a special kind of cowardice in a man who praises your strength, then asks you to use it to swallow his family's disrespect. Rosa held the place card in both hands. Guests saw it. A photographer lifted his camera, noticed her beside the catering doors, then turned his lens toward the flower wall. I took Rosa's arm and started toward the front row. Julian stepped in front of us. He did not touch me. He did something worse. He blocked the aisle and said, "Celia, please don't make this public." 2 attendants closed in beside him. Rosa whispered that she could sit anywhere if I wanted peace. That was the trap. They had chosen the one person loving enough to disappear for me, then counted on me to let her. I walked into the chapel only long enough to keep Rosa from carrying the scene alone. Then I got into the bridal car and sent Pippa one message: send me every version of the guest list. I want the approvals, not apologies. Before the car cleared the gates, I sent a second message to the photographer revoking permission to use my image in any Armitage press release. It was a small action, but it changed the air immediately. The family could still call Rosa's seat a mistake. It could no longer use my face to sell the ceremony while it did it. Julian called before I reached the guest house. I let the phone ring. For the first time, he was the one waiting outside the story. Rosa Wren was not my biological mother, which is precisely why I trusted what she gave me more than anything the Armitages now tried to baptize as destiny. She was my mother's older cousin, a school librarian with patient hands and a stubborn back. And when my mother died, she took me into a terrace house that always smelled faintly of tea leaves and old pages. She never asked me to forget the woman I had lost, never competed with grief, never used sacrifice as leverage. She just built a life around reliability. Hot meals when there was no appetite, rent money when my father vanished for months, and the kind of discipline that teaches a girl self-respect without making her feel borrowed. Everything Julian once claimed to admire in me had been shaped in Rosa's kitchen. My instinct to work, my intolerance for polished hypocrisy, my refusal to speak about loyalty as though it were slavery in formal clothes, all of it came from her. That is why Lady Armitage's order felt so obscene. She was not merely asking me to adjust a title. She was demanding that I amputate the woman who made me survivable and then call the wound elegance. When Julian first pursued me, he seemed to understand exactly what Rosa represented. He did not charm me with money because men born into that kind of money always overestimate its novelty. He charmed me by noticing history. He would ask what Rosa cooked when I was sick what books had made me brave, why I kept handwritten grocery lists even after every phone in the world could replace them. He said my life had texture, not polish, and that the Armitage world needed someone who remembered the difference. The first time Lady Armitage corrected Rosa in front of me, Julian sent flowers to Rosa rather than to me, and wrote a note that said, "No house worth entering should ask you to deny the woman who raised you." I held that note for weeks like a receipt for safety. Looking back, I see the pattern more clearly. Julian loved me most when honoring Rosa cost him nothing. The moment that honor threatened his public inheritance, his language softened, then narrowed, then retreated into the same family vocabulary that always turns betrayal into practicality. The warning signs began months before the ceremony, but powerful families train outsiders to misread early violence as administrative fussiness. At my first protocol fitting, Helena Price, Lady Armitage's speech coach, changed the way I was meant to introduce myself at charity events. Celia Wren, future Lady of Armitage House, became Celia, chosen daughter of the Armitage line. The wording sounded flattering until I realized it erased the woman and home that had actually made me. Then came the family briefing packet for sponsors, where my childhood was reduced to 3 bloodless sentences about a distant branch and an informal guardian arrangement. Rosa disappeared behind language, so carefully laundered it almost made me question my own anger. Each small edit asked me to exchange memory for access. Each time I resisted, Julian kissed my forehead, promised he would push back later, and asked me not to make singular issues into symbols. But singular issues are how systems announce themselves before they become undeniable. By the time I stood in the chapel courtyard, the ceremony was simply the first moment the private pattern had been promoted to spectacle. I started keeping screenshots because women who grow up around instability learn the value of a preserved version before anybody tells them one never existed. I saved draft guest lists where Rosa had first been marked as family and then pushed to guardian, then to support, then to nothing at all. I kept a voice note from Helena explaining that bloodline optics mattered most in press images. I printed the pre-approval ceremony booklet, in which Rosa's seat sat 3 rows closer to me than it did on the final version. None of that evidence looked dramatic on its own. It looked petty, almost embarrassing, the kind of archive a polished family would dismiss as emotional overreading. But I knew what it really showed. Intention. Bureaucratic intention, feminine intention, the kind that travels through calligraphy, programs, captions, and seating diagrams until a woman's life can be repackaged without anyone appearing to raise their voice. The day before the ceremony, I nearly deleted all of it because I wanted so badly to believe the wedding itself would prove I had worried for nothing. I am grateful now for every anxious little act of preservation I once apologized to myself for. 2 nights before the ceremony, Lady Armitage hosted a rehearsal supper in the mirrored gallery and decided to test her future rewrite in smaller company. She lifted a champagne flute, smiled at a row of donors' wives, and thanked the mothers who shaped this union, naming herself first and then Julian's late grandmother. Rosa was not mentioned at all. Afterward, when I challenged Julian, he told me his mother had only been following event flow, that public speaking required simplification, that the larger point was that everyone knew Rosa mattered privately again. That was the corridor he kept trying to push me into, the corridor where truth had to survive without ceremony while lies enjoyed floral arches and microphones. That night, I replayed his voice message twice before sleeping. He had said, with a tenderness I can still hear, that if his family ever tried to reduce Rosa, he would stand beside me before they finished the sentence. The promise was so specific that later betrayal could never hide behind misunderstanding. He had not failed because he did not know what mattered. He had failed because he knew exactly what mattered and still measured it against what the house expected from him. The final piece that made me stop hoping the insult would self-correct came from Rosa herself on the morning of the wedding. She asked me, very softly, whether I would still be marrying into the house if it required me to spend the rest of my life defending obvious truths one room at a time. She did not say it bitterly. She asked it like a librarian asks whether a book belongs in the wrong section, quietly, almost apologetically, while already suspecting the answer. I wanted to tell her love would fix the rest. I wanted to say marriage always requires compromise, that Lady Armitage would calm down after the cameras left, that Julian would become braver once I officially belonged. Instead, I heard myself say nothing at all. Silence was the first honest answer I had given that week. It was also the moment I understood that the family was not merely trying to insult Rosa before the ceremony. It was trying to train me for marriage by seeing whether I would betray the truest part of my own history in exchange for a title. Once I recognized the curriculum, refusing to graduate from it became the only form of self-respect left. By the next morning, the house narrative was already moving faster than grief. A family aide called to tell me there had been regrettable confusion at the ceremony and that Rosa herself had apparently requested a less prominent seat so the event would feel visually balanced. The lie was almost elegant. It borrowed Rosa's humility and turned it into consent. Then came a message from a society columnist saying sources close to the family insisted I had been emotional because wedding stress had reopened unresolved mourning. Within 12 hours, the event was being translated for public consumption. No cruelty, no intention, just a delicate bride and a generous old house trying to handle fragile feelings with tact. That was when anger stopped being hot in me and became strategic. Families like the Armitages do not win by producing better truth. They win by producing a faster story, one polished enough that honest people feel impolite interrupting it. If I wanted any chance of keeping my own life recognizable, I could not merely defend myself in private calls. I had to get ahead of their version before sympathy hardened into record. Pippa met me in an underground garage with 3 seating charts and 1 email chain. The first chart called Rosa Immediate Family. The last put her beside the service corridor. Lady Armitage wrote, "Visual distinction required." Then Julian replied from his own account, "Approved. Keep Rosa out of the principal photo line. Celia will settle once the ceremony starts." He had not only watched, he had given the instruction a green light. I photographed the charts, the email, and the timestamp. Then I sent copies to Rosa, my attorney, and a private address the Armitage office could not reach. Julian asked to meet me that afternoon in the Orangery, where he used to bring me when he wanted our conversations to feel separate from the house. The first thing he said was that he had not approved the exact seat. The second thing he said was worse. He had known his mother wanted a stronger symbolic distinction and had convinced himself the ceremony would pass too quickly for anyone to be deeply hurt. Men like Julian always underestimate wounds that are not happening to them in public. He kept insisting the bigger picture still mattered, that stepping away now would hand victory to gossips and family rivals, that after the wedding he could redraw boundaries from inside the institution. I listened until he ran out of refined cowardice, and then asked him whether the voice message he sent me had been true when he recorded it. He shut his eyes because he knew exactly which one I meant. He said yes. That answer condemned him more completely than denial would have. If the promise had been sincere, then his silence at the chapel was not confusion. It was a conscious trade. He had simply decided my gratitude to Rosa was negotiable once donors and bloodline entered the room. That night, Rosa tried to save me again, and the tenderness of it hurt almost more than the ceremony. She brought tea to the small guest house where I had retreated, sat across from me with her hands folded around a chipped blue cup, and said she would survive one bad seat if it meant I did not lose the future I had chosen. She reminded me that houses like the Armitages outlast individual humiliations precisely because they keep convincing decent women to calculate pain rather than confront it. She was trying to protect me, but protection can become a trap when it asks you to live inside someone else's lie for the rest of your life. I told her the problem was no longer the chair. The chair was only the visible part. The real violence was that Julian and his mother expected the person who raised me to accept ceremonial demotion, so they could debut me as something easier for the house to market. Rosa went quiet after that. Then she said, with the steadiness that had raised me, "If you marry them after understanding that sentence, You will spend every anniversary negotiating with yourself. She was right, and I hated how relieving it felt to hear truth stated so plainly. Helena sent the luncheon introduction next. It called me a woman, completed by Armitage House. Rosa had been reduced to a footnote. Mrs. Fenwick added one sentence. Lady Armitage had ordered staff to keep Rosa out of the principal photo line. I did not need more documents. The pattern was clear, and the photo gallery would prove it to everyone else. Father Elias Moore, the family chaplain, surprised me by becoming one of those witnesses. He asked me to stop by the rectory under the pretext of discussing revised vows, and once the door closed, he told me he had watched Lady Armitage push for two wording changes that troubled him deeply. The first removed any blessing for those who had nurtured the couple outside the direct line. The second inserted a line about proper inheritance of household memory through recognized mothers. He said he had objected gently and been told spiritual language should not interfere with dynastic clarity. Hearing a priest use those words with visible disgust stripped away the last remaining veil of doubt in me. If even the sacramental language had been rewritten to support the same exclusion, then what happened at the ceremony was not spontaneous snobbery. It was doctrine and development. Father Elias did not offer outrage. He offered copies of the draft language, a quiet promise to answer direct questions truthfully if asked in a public room, and a warning that once women of the house realize a bride will not cooperate, they often switch from charm to character assassination with breathtaking speed. He was right about the speed. By evening, a note appeared in an online-style column suggesting I had grown possessive about house traditions because I feared never fully belonging to old lineage. The smear was clever because it inverted the truth. They had publicly wounded the exact place where I belonged most, then fed the world a story in which my objection proved I was too insecure for marriage. Reading it, I finally understood what made the Armitage machine so effective. It never only harmed you. It rearranged your reaction until any self-defense looked like confirmation of the family's private diagnosis. That was why a quiet refusal would not save me. If I left without explaining, they would say I fled because I was unstable. If I stayed and complied, they would say I had matured into their world. The only option that preserved reality was exposure in the family's own preferred language, documents, sequence, witness memory, and the exact words Julian used when he thought tenderness could coexist with cowardice. By midnight, I knew the blessing luncheon scheduled for the following day would not be a repair session. It would be the room where I forced their polished story to answer to chronology. Before the luncheon, the Armitage office released its official engagement gallery. 12 photographs. Rosa was missing from every one. In the only frame where she should have stood beside me, the crop began at my shoulder. The caption said I had been shaped by the values of Armitage House. No Rosa, no mention of the woman who raised me. They were not fixing a bad seat. They were preparing a public version of my life that could survive without her. I saved the gallery before they could change it. Then I chose the only 3 things the room needed to see: the seat they gave Rosa, Julian's promise, and the photographs that proved they intended to erase her after the wedding. I made my next move before anyone could call it a misunderstanding. I sent the original seating chart, Julian's approval email, and the photo gallery to 3 people: Pippa, Father Elias, and Miriam Voss, the foundation donor Julian had spent months trying to impress. I did not ask any of them to rescue me. I asked one question: would you be willing to say what you saw if Lady Armitage denies it? Pippa answered first. Yes. Father Elias sent back a photograph of the blessing draft with his initials beside the lines Lady Armitage had removed. Miriam did not answer for 40 minutes. Then a message arrived. I will attend the luncheon. Do not let them move this into a private room. Lady Armitage answered with an attack of her own. A courier brought a garment bag to the guest house. Inside was a cream dress, a replacement program, and a handwritten note. It said Rosa could sit at the reception table if I agreed to return before the luncheon and read the revised family statement. The offer sounded generous until I saw the final line. All prior versions of the day must be treated as confidential family misunderstandings. They wanted me to trade Rosa's public dignity for my silence. I took a photograph of the note. Then I sent the dress back unopened. Julian came to the guest house just before noon. He said the email had been written by an assistant and that he had only approved the schedule. I opened the attachment on my phone. His name was at the bottom. His personal password had authorized it. When I asked why he had written that I would settle once the ceremony began, he did not deny it. He said, "I thought you would choose us." I told him he had finally understood the problem. He had never asked me to join his family. He had asked me to abandon mine. I spent the night building a packet, so precise it felt like prayer. On the bedspread in the guest house, I laid out the annotated seating charts, Helena's revised speaking notes, the floor sheet, Father's draft blessing language, screenshots of the evolving guest lists, and a full transcript of Julian's voice message. I listened to that message 6 times while transcribing because I wanted no one later to claim I had exaggerated his promise. He said clearly that no one in his family would ever dishonor Rosa while I stood beside him. He said I would never be asked to perform gratitude for cruelty. He said if his mother forgot herself, he would remember us both. Writing those lines by hand changed the script inside me. The question was no longer whether Julian loved me in some private, weakened way. The question was whether private love had any moral value once it became obedient to public humiliation. By dawn, my answer was complete. Love that needs my guardian humiliated before it can survive is only vanity dressed as devotion. And I was done kneeling to it. I also chose my witnesses with care because one lesson Rosa taught me early was that truth should never depend on a single shaking voice if several steady ones exist. Pippa Shaw agreed to confirm the seating chart revisions and Lady Armitage's blue ink note. Mrs. Fenwick agreed to verify the floral downgrade and the staff instructions about keeping Rosa away from the principal photo corridor. Father Elias would answer direct questions about the rewritten blessing language if anyone accused me of dramatizing protocol. None of them were there to rescue me. That distinction mattered. The Armitages believed a woman only becomes credible when a more institutionally approved voice lends her legitimacy. I intended to invert that arrangement. Their statements would not replace mine. They would prove that my version had been the stable center all along while the family scrambled to manufacture elegance around injury. Before leaving for the luncheon, I called Rosa and told her I was not asking permission. Only honesty. Could she bear one more public room if I made that room pay for what it had done? She was quiet for a moment, then said, "If you are going to speak, speak so clearly that you never have to beg the room to remember later." Lady Armitage tried one final containment maneuver at 10:30. A black car arrived at the guest house with a handwritten invitation to meet privately in the West drawing room before the luncheon. The note promised Grace sensitivity and a dignified path toward mutual understanding. I almost laughed when I read it because mutual understanding is what powerful women call surrender when they need the word to sound silk-lined. I knew exactly what awaited me in that room. A controlled apology, a slight adjustment to Rosa's public title, perhaps an offer to let her light a candle or appear in a family photograph, all in exchange for my consent to proceed. It would have been enough to calm most scandals, because most scandals are born from misunderstanding, not design. But I had watched too many layers of intention accumulate to be bought back with better manners. I sent the car away with one sentence for Lady Armitage: "Any dignity available today will have to survive witnesses." That line steadied me more than I expected. It reminded me that I was no longer improvising from hurt. I was choosing the exact terrain on which they would lose control. The blessing luncheon was held in the long conservatory behind the house, a room built to flatter inherited power. White hydrangeas ran down the center table, sunlight caught on old portraits, and every guest had been selected for symbolic value rather than intimacy. Lady Armitage opened with a toast to continuity and women who understand how to protect great houses from sentimentality. Julian followed, thanking his mother for teaching us that belonging becomes strongest when it is properly named. The sentence was meant to land as elegant filial devotion. In my ears, it sounded like confession wearing cufflinks. Then Helena stepped toward the lectern to read the formal family acknowledgement, in which I was expected to publicly transition from the Wren story into the Armitage story. I stood before she could finish the first paragraph. My knees were steady. My voice was steady. Years earlier, I might have begged the room to trust my feelings. That day, I asked for something stronger and far less flattering to the family. I asked for the privilege of reading the family's own sequence of decisions aloud before anyone blessed a union built on their denial. No one stopped me because wealth teaches people many reflexes, but certainty under documentation still scrambles them. I began with the simplest fact: the approved seating note placing Rosa by the service corridor under the instruction "visual distinction required." Then I read Helena's revised introduction about my formation being completed by the house. Then Father Elias, when asked directly whether the blessing language had been changed to privilege recognized mothers of line, answered yes in a voice so calm it made Lady Armitage's face lose color for the first time all week. Finally, I held up the transcript of Julian's voice message and asked him, in front of every witness he cared about, whether he disputed any word in it. He did not. He just said my name the way frightened men do when they hope intimacy can postpone judgment. So I played the recording from my phone through the room's portable speaker. His promise filled the conservatory with such painful tenderness that several guests looked physically embarrassed to be hearing it alongside the evidence of what he allowed. That was the moment the family's version ceased to be persuasive even to people invested in its survival. What broke the room was the evidence. I showed the seat Julian's promise, and the edits that erased Rosa. Then Miriam Voss, the foundation's largest donor, stood up. She looked at Lady Armitage and said, "Interesting, because that is exactly what your family did." She froze her foundation's pledge until the Armitages could explain why their public values required Rosa to disappear. Another donor asked Julian whether vows meant anything if he protected his mother more than the woman he claimed to love. The family had lost control of the room. Its own circle had stopped translating bloodline into morality. Lady Armitage attempted recovery with the discipline of a woman who had spent a lifetime surviving her own conscience through superior staging. She rose, thanked me for my passion, and suggested that weddings often awaken grief in complicated family histories. Then she offered the house's first polished concession. Rosa would, of course, be restored to a more suitable place in future family appearances, and the wording of the luncheon acknowledgement could be softened before any public distribution. Softened, restored. Future. Every phrase was engineered to move the harm out of the present tense and back into territory the family could still curate. I listened without interrupting because sometimes the cleanest way to expose a manipulator is to let her finish arranging the velvet around the knife. When she finally paused, I told her the problem was not that Rosa lacked a better seat tomorrow. The problem was that today the House believed it had the moral right to test whether I would cooperate in stripping her of visible honor. Once a family asks that question out loud, there is no etiquette solution left. There is only the answer the targeted woman gives it. Julian broke next, and I will give him this much: fear made him honest faster than love ever did. He admitted he had heard his mother's plan in advance. He admitted he thought the insult could be contained if the day moved quickly enough. He admitted he asked me for patience because he believed I loved him too much to blow up the ceremony, and because somewhere deep down he assumed Rosa would choose my future over her own public dignity. The confession was halting, self-protective, and ugly, but it was enough. A man does not need to shout to reveal himself. Sometimes all he has to do is describe the calculation he thought a good woman would quietly make on his behalf. Hearing him say it in front of witnesses lifted something heavy off my chest. For days I had been fighting the temptation to turn his silence into complexity, to search for buried nobility under weak choices. His own words saved me from that labor. He had loved me as long as love did not demand conflict with inheritance. Once it did, he offered me postponement. That was not tragedy. It was hierarchy. The family tried one final bargain after the room turned against them. Lady Armitage said the wedding could still proceed if all official materials were corrected immediately. Rosa were reseated at the head table for the reception, and a public note were issued honoring the women who shaped me before I entered the house. In other words, they offered the appearance of repair as long as I continued lending my face to the institution that had authored the wound. The old version of me, the one raised to mistake late recognition for justice, might once have found that offer intoxicating. It contained all the furniture of vindication, public apology, visible elevation, proof that the house could be made to bend. But bending is not the same as transformation, and I had finally learned the difference. I told them I was not interested in being better displayed by people who only respected my truth after it became dangerous to deny. If I married Julian now, every anniversary photo would carry the memory of the service door chair, and the morning his mother tried to recruit me into renaming my own mother in exchange for inherited approval. I would rather grieve a future than inhabit that ritual for life. So I removed the ring in full view of everyone. The room became very quiet, not because jewelry matters, but because symbols terrify families that rely on symbols to govern reality. I set the ring on top of the revised program and said, calmly, that I would not enter any house that required Rosa Wren to become decorative evidence of my gratitude rather than acknowledged truth of my life. Then I crossed the conservatory to Rosa. She was crying in the dignified, furious way women cry when they would rather split stone than be pitted. I took her hand and said the sentence I should have said the first second I saw that seating chart. You are my mother in every way that built me, and no title they own can outvote that. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The words landed because everybody in that room understood exactly what the family had tried to extract from me, and exactly why I was refusing. Lady Armitage looked smaller then, not because she had lost money or rank in that instant, but because the moral scale of the room had shifted and she could not control it with posture anymore. The operational fallout began before the luncheon even ended. Two sponsor couples asked that the family office halt all wedding communications until the contradiction between the ceremony behavior and the house's public values could be reviewed. Helena quietly stepped away from the lectern and never returned. Father Elias informed the room that he would not officiate any vows built on coerced erasure of maternal truth. Mrs. Fenwick, who had spent decades watching people swallow humiliation for the sake of silverware, stood a fraction straighter than I had ever seen. Those details mattered to me more than scandal headlines would have, because they meant the consequences were not merely emotional. The machine had jammed. Staff could no longer pretend they did not know. Guests could no longer claim confusion. The family would have to choose between correcting records and openly defending the logic of what it had done. For the first time since meeting Julian, I saw the Armitage house not as an inevitable weather system, but as a structure maintained by human compliance. Compliance can disappear much faster than legacy brochures suggest once witnesses realize the bride has stopped helping them lie. Rosa and I left through the side garden rather than the front steps because I had no interest in giving the photographers a grief pageant they could sell back to the family as romantic tragedy. Outside, the late afternoon air felt almost shockingly ordinary. Bees moved through the lavender. Delivery vans still came and went at the service gate. Somewhere inside the house, powerful people were already negotiating language to survive what had happened. None of that urgency belonged to me anymore. Rosa asked whether I was frightened, and I told her yes, but the fear felt cleaner than the obedience I had almost called maturity for months. I was frightened of fallout, gossip, and the blank space where a wedding had been. I was not frightened of my own reflection, and that difference felt like oxygen. Before we drove away, I looked back once at the conservatory windows and realized the family had spent all week trying to teach me that belonging could only be granted from above. They were wrong. Belonging had already existed in Rosa's kitchen. In every school book she labeled with my name, in every stubborn lesson about dignity she taught without making a performance of sacrifice. That was the home I chose. The rest was architecture. 6 months later, the Armitage Foundation removed Lady Armitage from its public events after donors made clear that no new campaign could survive another performance of selective family values. Julian no longer had a wedding to postpone into obedience. He had the inheritance he had protected and the reputation of a man who had traded love for it. Those consequences did not return the ceremony they took from Rosa and me. They did something more useful. They made the cost visible. Rosa did not need a better chair from that family. She had a place no brochure, title, or bloodline could take from her. I built a life where I no longer introduced myself as someone waiting to be accepted. I was Celia Wren, Rosa's daughter by every truth that mattered, and I had stopped mistaking permission for belonging. Rosa squeezed my hand and smiled. This time, no one asked her to disappear.